Hey, PreSales Collective, it's your host, James Kaikis, and today I'm going to be joined by Rob Johnson, VP of EMEA Solutions Engineering at Celonis. The topic of today's episode is leadership development. Today, Rob and I are going to discuss a number of components as it pertains to leadership development. We're going to get his experience throughout his career on how he empowered people, instituted cultures of trust, and even talked about self-awareness with him and his teams. The interesting thing about today's episode is Rob is going to make a parallel to pre-sales that you're not going to expect. It's very interesting, and he does a great job of articulating it. Enjoy today's episode. Today's episode is sponsored by Vidyard. With Vidyard, you can record and send custom video messages to your prospects and customers to stand out, clearly explain ideas, and connect on a more personal level. With Vidyard Pro, you can gain access to rich viewer analytics, customize your video playback experience, add your own call to actions after the video, and more. Sign up for Vidyard for free at www.vidyard.com. Once your account is active, select the upgrade option and use promo podcast PSC for a free 30-day trial of Vidyard Pro. Rob, welcome to the PreSales Podcast. How are you today?
Hey, great to see you, James. Really well. You?
I'm great. Thanks for joining us today. This has been a couple months in the making. You and I have had conversations a few months ago and said, hey, let's do a podcast. Unbeknown, you had said, I have some changes happening in my career. Let me get back to you. And so congratulations on your new role at Celonis. How's that been going?
Yeah, it's fantastic. Currently serving as the EMEA Solutions Engineering leader at Celonis. So quick shout out to all the Celonauts. And I think I've learned a couple of things really quickly. But data is just not something to stare at and admire. It's got to drive businesses forward. It drives decisions. It drives actions. It drives new outcomes for companies so they can kind of achieve their business breakthroughs. And just yesterday, I saw the CEO of BP reference us in his earnings call, and that's pretty powerful stuff. I think, like Celonis, there are many other people out there in the SaaS industry who exist to answer one simple question for our customers, and that's just like, what's the value? Prior to Celonis, I worked for ServiceNow for 5 years in the UK, so shout out to the old crew there, beautiful team of people. And of course, they're helping customers change the experience of getting mundane work done. And then prior to that, I worked for a global systems integrator for 10 years at NTT. And then before that, worked for a couple of small startup companies here in London and in the UK.
Well, that's incredible. I mean, there's nothing more than validation from the CEO on their earnings call. I mean, that's pretty impactful. That's value right there for sure.
Yeah, and that actually did just happen, right? I just got this note, and it was the CFO as well. So the CEO's on the earnings call, and then the CFO did the quote. It's just like, it's phenomenal.
You've had a great ride from ServiceNow to Celonis. So I'm definitely excited for you and your career journey. But I want to get into a topic that I know you're really passionate about, which is leadership development. You and I had a conversation a couple months ago. We talked about empowering employees and empowering management. And so for today's episode, I really want to talk about leadership development and get your perspective on this topic, because I think you have a fantastic perspective and I want to share that with our audience. So are you ready?
Yeah, go for it.
I'm going to start today's podcast a little bit differently. For those who don't know you, Rob, you have a blog called More Giraffe. I want to understand the giraffe references and why giraffes matter to you. Tell us about your love for giraffes. Let's start there.
It's actually my family. My family loves giraffes. And two things. During COVID-19, we sponsored two, Cillian and Setanta, and they're located in the UK at a place called Port Lymph, which is a conservation where we're helping support their mission to protect animals. But actually on the blog that I set up, there's a photo, and that photo was taken back in 2001, where I had my honeymoon in the Pilanesberg National Park. And that hot air balloon safari was a wedding gift from our late grandparents. So it was that experience back in 2001 that really sowed the seeds of loving this animal. But it's all through my wife and my two daughters.
People are probably like, why are we starting off talking about giraffes? But on your blog, you actually have some really impactful articles around the giraffe and how it actually applies to pre-sales leaders. And one of them is that you mentioned that pre-sales leaders need to be more like the giraffe than the lion. So can you discuss what that actually means?
I think there's a couple of things, right? So first of all, I just set that up when I had some spare time, and I don't have any spare time anymore. So I haven't updated it for a while. But why the name More Giraffe? Giraffes have got traits and characteristics as leaders that we can all learn from. And I think some are especially relevant for pre-sales leaders. So it was just a motivation call out to other SE leaders to be a little bit more giraffe-like in your leadership. And so if I think about what does that really mean, if you think about, servant leadership, right? A giraffe's heart's 2 foot long. So effective executive pre-sale leaders need really high emotional intelligence. And the more hearts invested in teams, often the greater the outcomes. A couple of other examples, right? You've got to stick your neck out for your team. Great leaders display their strengths, expose their vulnerabilities, and then take real informed risks to survive and thrive. And that's really similar to how kind of giraffes operate. Remaining calm under pressure, right? It's a really fast-paced industry that we're in that comes with an unconventional set of working hours and lots of pressure. Now, deep in the giraffe's neck, there's a series of valves that regulate the flow of blood to the head. And so to avoid collapsing under pressure, a leader's got to learn to manage that pressure while maintaining an elevated perspective. So there's lots of really nice kind of metaphors that you can use with the animal once you get to know it that kind of translate into some of the leadership characteristics and traits of your team.
I think that's very pre-sales of you to be able to talk about the giraffe and how it translates to a pre-sales professional. Because one of the things that you had on your blog that really resonated with me, because I took a note, is when you compared the lion to the giraffe.
One of the questions that I asked myself is, why do I think pre-sale leaders are more like giraffes than lions? And I stumbled across a great book by a guy called Dr. Hubert Glover. It's quite sad, actually, because I found out he had passed away during this kind of discovery process. This guy was really inspired by the behaviors of the giraffe in the wild and how it relates to 21st century leadership. So you think about the giraffe looking out on the long run versus the short run. If you think about moving forward to inspire and never stop kind of learning mindset and how the giraffes communicate, how they can blend into new herds, just enable different diversity of thought and diversity of people. And they deal with the predator, and the predator's the lion who's seeking to kind of disrupt change. So I kind of pondered that question, why do I think pre-sale leaders are more like giraffes than predators? And the conclusions that I drew from reading the doctor's book and just some of my own experiences is that the best leaders that I've ever worked with and have been inspired by are those that focus on the herd, not just themselves. The best people that have inspired and motivated me are the ones who can keep moving forward on a clear path and don't look back. They just keep moving forward. If you look at a giraffe, even when there's a lion on the prowl, right, he's still moving forward with the herd. And then the third one just was around encouraging and inspiring kind of deliberate learning. And I think pre-sale leaders do that. And sometimes they do that without recognizing that they're doing it. And then Dr. Glover pointed out, it's really odd when a giraffe spots its main predator in the distance, because the giraffe will keep moving towards the lion. It won't actually move away from it. And that's because the giraffe has a clear mission for itself and the herd, both for the near and the long term. So yeah, that was my conclusion. And the question that I asked the team is, hey, if you could be any animal and you work in pre-sales, what would your animal be and why?
I love that we're talking about giraffes on the PreSales podcast. This is definitely going to a different place than we usually do. But I love that you've given parallels between an animal in the wild and pre-sales leaders in our organizations, because as you talk about your examples, I can sit here and clearly think about things that resonate with me as a leader and things that I've done in my career or others have done in their career. And I love that example. One of the things that you've talked about too is vision. The giraffe has this amazing vision. And as pre-sales leaders, especially in early stage companies or very high paced companies, we have to have vision. We have to be able to set a mission and a vision and inspire those. This is my last question on the giraffe, but talk to me about the giraffe's vision and how that applies to your own experience at Celonis now.
So I think there's two things. One is, if you think about inspiring teams, I'm a big fan of inspiring people to recognize their uniqueness. And just like human fingerprints, I don't know if you know, but no two giraffes have the same coat pattern. And so that's something that really speaks to me when you want to look at the uniqueness of people and supporting people. But to be able to do that, you have to have excellent vision. Now, giraffes, they can see in color and they can see over great distances frontally, and their peripheral vision is so wide angle, they can essentially see behind themselves as well. If only we could do that, right? So their keen eyesight not only lets them scan for the predators, especially lions, which are one of their biggest threats other than humans, but they can also keep track of each other. And I think just as a pre-sale leader, one of the objectives that I always set myself is, how do I increase visibility as to what's occurring inside the organization as well as what's occurring outside the organization, and try not to get too short-sighted with the key objectives that are really important that you have to deliver on, like, for example, influencing revenue, right? But it's really about that long-term sustainability. How do you see what's out there for the long run? And how do you keep your vision focused on both that short-term and long-term view?
Rob, thank you so much for walking us through that. And I think you're exactly right. It is sometimes very hard to manage both the short-term and the long-term vision of things, and making sure that you as a leader are instilling that within your team, but that the company is also aligned on that perspective. And so that's got me thinking about our people. You ran a fairly large and successful team at ServiceNow over an impressive growth timeline as well. So what do you think that you do differently when it comes to empowering your people?
I'm going to answer this in a couple of ways, right? My first gut reaction is, I actually don't think I did anything different. And so go ask the team and see what they say. Then if I take a pause and I reflect, I think about a couple of things. Someone once said to me, you won't get to where you want to get to next if you were the person that got you to where you are. And I don't know who quoted it, but my personal opinion is that's absolutely rubbish. If you show up as your authentic self, you live to your inner values, you do the right thing, you will create trust. And when you create trust, you can ask your team the question. And the question I used to ask the team over at ServiceNow was, hey, how do I make you feel? And then I'd listen to them and I'd take their feedback and course correct, adjust, or continue, right? And they'd say things like, I gave them space, I supported them in the difficult times, I fought for them in the dangerous times, and I took a back seat in the good times. And I think I learned that from some of the great leaders around me. So yeah, on one hand, I don't think I did anything different. On the other hand, the team would say, and I think you should listen to what the team say rather than what I say on that one.
I like your breakdown there around giving space and removing roadblocks. How did you create a culture of trust? Because that's something that we talk about a lot in the PreSales podcast, is creating a culture of feedback or creating a culture of trust, because I think it's so much easier said than done and takes a lot of intention within a team, within an organization. So what are some ways that you did that and built that level of trust with your team?
Yeah, people used to say to me, hey, you're so lucky. And I never quite understood what they meant by that. But what they were trying to say to me is that our team and our leadership team had such a implicit trust with each other, but other teams didn't have that, right? So sometimes you forget that you're not part of the norm and that you've created something that's a bit different to how others experience it. I think it comes around to self-awareness. And the reason why I'm going to link it to that is I've got a few non-negotiables as a leader. And one of them is knowing your psychology because of the impact you have on people around you. And if you don't understand your psychology and you don't understand your impact on the people around you, for me, that's really dangerous. There's a doctor that I know called Dr. Maria, and she's got this lovely quote where she says, like, emotions are as psychologically contagious as COVID-19 is physically infectious, right? So just being aware of how you affect others is really, really paramount important to the future of work. And as leaders, we can't afford to ignore that. And so it's a bit like taking your car for an MOT every year, right? Make sure you do the same with your brain, because human behavior is fundamental to who we are, what we do, why we think, why we feel, the way we feel. So if I had to come back to answer your question, I think it's just about recognizing everybody has uniqueness and treating everybody as an individual. And when you do that, you foster and create trust quicker than without it, in my experience.
I love that you've talked about it on a couple of times, is individualism or understanding people and individual strengths. That is how you can have the most impactful team or create the best culture of trust, is you allow people to bring their whole self to work. And you figure out as a leader how the puzzle fits and how you maximize each individual while also maximizing each other. And I think that's one of the biggest things when it comes to leadership, is creating that maximization of your employees, even for PreSales Collective. So I'm actually working with a coach, Ross Rotherham, and he's working with the PreSales Leadership Collective team, because we're a small team, we're a fast-moving startup, and we're actually doing some strengths work right now and understanding what each of our strengths are, and not only understanding what our strengths and our non-strengths are, but also understanding each other, because I think that is what, really can allow us to maximize our potential as a team and our impact on the community. And I think it goes to the point that you mentioned about self-awareness. I am a huge fan of self-awareness.
Yeah, I love that. I've actually got a book on my desk, and literally the call before this podcast was with one of my leaders in the UK, where I'm going to facilitate a session, and it's called At Your Best. And it's something that I did in the previous organization as well, right? But what do you do when you're at best? What was the best thing about you when you were at your best? What were you enjoying the most? What was the most fulfilling experience? And what was that best project that you've ever worked on? And what were the things that you thought that you brought to that team? And then linking it back to the strengths. Celonis is a big supporter of the Gallup StrengthsFinder. And every new employee goes through a really great exercise with a psychologist around their strengths and discovering their strengths with other people cross-functionally. And then that's also something that we do as a team as well.
We're using the Gallup StrengthsFinder as well. I mean, it's really impactful. You learn a lot about yourself and learn a lot about others and essentially where your strengths are and non-strengths are. I want to get your perspective on one thing when it comes to self-awareness. I feel like personally, I have spent the last decade really learning and understanding what self-awareness is, how to analyze, adapt, and grow and make that part of my DNA. But I have been at times early in my career where I really didn't have much self-awareness. And I talk to people who say, hey, I'm trying to work on becoming a little bit more self-aware so I can grow. Because that's where I think we maximize our potential and our impact. Have you ever been in a situation where someone on your team was struggling with self-awareness and you're creating that culture of trust and that culture of feedback, but what have you done to get those people across the line and seen that success of really becoming introspective and understanding how their impact can be multiplied once they unlock their potential?
If I swing it back to the giraffe for a minute, right? Baby giraffes, right? They don't go to a PreSales Academy school, right? But they learn a really tough lesson very quickly in life. The birth of a baby giraffe is a tough landing. It basically falls out of its mother's womb, which is typically about 10 feet off the ground. For those that are interested, that helps snap the umbilical cord so the giraffe can breathe. If you think about the giraffe's mother's goal is to ensure the baby can stand up and walk so it's not eaten. And she nurtures that giraffe and the herd, and they will take share in nurturing and protecting it. For pre-sales talent, that road to success is never an easy one. There's always obstacles that you're going to fall over at some point or get hit by a roadblock or taste some kind of failure. But success lies in being able to get up every time you fall. I mean, that's a critical life skill, not just in pre-sales, just in general. And it is the habit of all successful people. It doesn't matter how hard you fall, just pick yourself back up and get back up on your feet, right? Now, the great thing is about pre-sales, we don't have the threat of carnivorous animals trying to take chunks out of us. We do have unhappy salespeople, dissatisfied customers. But what I tend to find is the difference in a great pre-sales manager versus what I'd call just someone doing their job is that ability to nurture, just like a kind of mother giraffe would. Now, for your example, I think every day you have to practice self-awareness. I'm a big believer that you can get better at something if you practice it. And even today, I don't get it right. What I've noticed over time, my gap to recognizing gets shorter and shorter and shorter and shorter. So one instance, my emotions may take over me. Before, it would have taken me never to reflect on it, to 24 hours to reflect on it, to 12 hours, to 6 hours, to 2 hours, to 1 minute, to 30 seconds, to 15 seconds, to 5 seconds. The more you practice it, the better you get, in my experience. So you just have to be aware of it. And the best way of being aware of it is doing standard tests. Like, what's your EQ? When was the last time you measured it? How do you know your own assessment of yourself? What are you using to do that assessment? How are you evaluating it? How are you getting a 360 view on it? I think all those things all make up the ability to grow and strengthen your self-awareness over time. But it's a skill and you have to practice it every day.
There's one thing that you said there that has really resonated is you acknowledged, despite being in this career for multiple decades and being very experienced, you just acknowledge that you make mistakes and you make mistakes and sometimes don't get everything right, but you've learned to acknowledge and realize that if you do make a mistake, you understand that right away versus, 1 week or 2 weeks later. And I think that's really an important skill because I think there's so many people who've been doing a certain job, and we'll call it obviously pre-sales right now, for decades. And they think, hey, I know everything that there is to know. I'm an expert and I'm a pro, but I'm a firm believer that there's always something more to learn. John Wooden, a famous UCLA basketball coach, says it's what you learn after you know it all that counts. And it's that idea of that continuous learning, continuous improvement. So I appreciate that you acknowledge that there's still mistakes that could be made no matter how many times you've done it, but it's acknowledging that gap.
Yeah, I agree. Have you ever read the book Made to Stick?
I haven't read Made to Stick. Tell me about Made to Stick.
So it introduces the concept that knowledge is a curse. Right? So once we know something, it's really hard to imagine what it was like not to know it. And what I've learned during my life is that the less I know about something, the better the question I ask. So I constantly try and remind myself not to know something because I know I'll ask a better question because of it.
I like that a lot. Essentially where assumptions come into play. And Ed Jaffe on the PreSales Collective blog wrote a great article on the curse of knowledge. And this happens a lot with pre-sales professionals, especially if you've been in a company for 3, 4, 5, 6+ years, you know the product inside and out. Sometimes when you're hearing that customer, you might not actually be hearing them. You're just thinking about how you're going to answer because you've done it so many times. So I like that you talk about curse of knowledge. I want to get your perspective on something that is starting to be a little bit more of a common theme around our pre-sales leadership collective, and that's mentorship. How have mentors played a role in your leadership development throughout your career?
As part of my introduction to onboarding at Celonis, a few of the team asked if they could get to know me a little bit more. So I shared this kind of one-page story that said, look, without giving away my age, here's my career and the companies that I've worked with. And at every point, when you reflect back, you can see that there was somebody somewhere supporting me. And that's really, really important to be able to go back and recognize that every pivotal moment in my career, there's been someone that's a supporter. So if I take, for example, now working to come at Celonis, my new boss is supporting me, right? Without his support, I would not be successful. You can argue when I was at ServiceNow, my boss there, I will say without his leadership and his mentorship, I would not have been successful. So you can identify people and moments that matter throughout your entire career when you can say, I owe that to that person or that person contributed. So I'm very much a big believer in recognizing those who help you on your journey, some formally, right, some informally. The best mentors I've ever had are the ones I call my friends and still pick up the phone to today from like 7, 8 years ago, because they never had a vested interest. And that's the difference that I see. There are some people that want to be on a mentor program, right? And they want to leverage someone's skill or leverage someone's capability, but they don't really want to build a trusted, meaningful relationship that can last a lifetime with those people. I think that's a bit of a shame. Whereas in my career, when I go back, I still stay in touch and talk to people. When I was at this tiny startup back in 1999, right? They're sustainable relationships. So I think mentorship is a really key part of your leadership development, but so is friendship. And I think the two can intertwine if you get it right.
One of the things I hear so much with PreSales Collective is I want a mentor. People want to go through a more formal, official process. And it's always tough. It's all, how do you find a mentor? How do you find the right match? I think to your point, what I've learned is just sometimes having an open conversation with someone with the intention of just learning in a one-time experience can sometimes turn to a very fruitful and long-term relationship that's very impactful. And actually, Jeff Margulies is the individual who introduced me to the idea of sponsorship in addition to mentorship. And I wasn't really familiar with sponsorship and how sponsorship can essentially be viewed as two-way, where you're a leader and you're developing somebody because down the road, they could come to work for you. You could send someone to go work for them. I really love that component because that's this whole giving back. And I think that's one of the core pillars of what we do with PreSales Collective, and especially the Leadership Collective, that is making such an impact in the community. Rob, I've really enjoyed the conversation today. I did not expect to be talking about drafts today, but I appreciate you making those examples and those comparisons to pre-sales. We've talked about a lot of topics when it comes to leadership development and gone in a couple of different places. But one of the things we talked about was knowing it all previously. And so I would like your advice to leaders who feel like maybe they know it all and there's nothing left to learn. What would you say to those people?
I would say, and I'll quote, in the beginner's mind, there are many possibilities. In the expert's mind, there are few. And I think building great teams doesn't require an expert mind. It requires a beginner's mind. So just try and approach problems as a novice, even if you know that you know a lot. And that quote, in the beginner's mind, there are many possibilities. In the expert mind, there are few, is a quote from the Zen, The Beginner's Mind book. And I agree with what they say. Approach every problem as if you're a novice. You'll ask better questions for it.
I love that you talk about beginner's mind. It's one of my favorite aspects of Mark Benioff's Trailblazer book as well. He makes that part of the DNA. Rob, it's been great having you on the podcast today. I really appreciate the conversation. I really appreciate your continued support of PreSales Leadership Collective. And thanks for joining me today.
Yes, pleasure. What you guys are doing is fantastic. Keep doing the great work.
Really appreciate it. See you next time.
Cheers.
All right, PreSales Collective, I bet you didn't expect to hear about giraffes in today's podcast, but I think Rob did a great job of explaining the parallels between the giraffe and pre-sales professionals, especially as we talk about focusing on the herd and the giraffe's vision. But really what Rob talked about was showing up as your authentic self as a leader and creating a culture of trust and inspiring uniqueness within your team. The question Rob said is, as a leader, how do I make you feel? How does he make his managers feel? How do they make their employees feel? And creating that bond within your organization is really critical in terms of working together. One of the things that Rob talked about as a leader is that he has his non-negotiables, and know your psychology and know the impact it has on your team and on your employees. Previously on the PreSales Collective podcast, Toby Penn and I discussed the power of a positive team. And it's very similar to what Rob is saying, is understanding your strengths and knowing your psychology and the impact it will make across your organization. One of the things that really stood out was Rob's perspective on self-awareness. And not just that he makes mistakes, but recognizing the gap and mitigating that gap down to say, I made this mistake, but it took me a month to realize it, to it took me 2 weeks, to 1 day, to 1 hour. That really is what many of us go on in our leadership journey. And as we talk about our leadership journey, there's always somebody supporting us. We never get there alone. It could be a manager, it could be a friend, a mentor, a sponsor, even someone who's on your team. They're supporting you on that journey. And really, as leaders, it's all about the journey and our developments and our improvements and what we do to make an impact within our team and grow as leaders. All right, PreSales Collective, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. As always, please like and share the podcast. If you have an episode or a topic you want to hear me talk about, please reach out to me. Otherwise, I will see you next week.